Against the backdrop of the inaugural Korea-Africa Summit on this Tuesday, we touch upon Korea's official development assistance plan for the continent this year and more on this edition of Issues and Insiders. Welcome to Tuesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we address Korea's official development assistance to its counterparts in Africa amid its inaugural summit with the continent here in the country. For more on this, I have Oh Seong-ik from the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport. Mr. Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I also have Kwon Soa with us. Soa, welcome back.
Happy to be here, Sunny.
Right, Soa, let's begin with some details about Korea's official development assistance plan for Africa.
Well, since President Yoon Suk-yeol's term kicked off in 2022, the president had emphasized the diverse potentials for South Korea in the African continent, along with the country's wish to become a more responsible donor country. Now, noting that the government has increased ODA in Africa tenfold in the span of 15 years, he cited assessments that say the scale was not enough. With that, President Yoon had stressed the need for a dramatic expansion in size and the creation of a Korean-style development cooperation project based on the sharing of Korean technology and experience. Experience, of course, because Korea used to be a donor recipient and now is an aid giver. Now, the government vowed to double ODA by 2030 from the amount it provided in 2019. Part of the Yoon administration's policy direction in terms of cooperation with African countries is the reorganization of economic fundamentals to be centered on the private sector. That includes more efforts in meeting the needs of private companies through the diversification of ODA through the Economic Development Cooperation Fund, or EDCF, a program that promotes economic cooperation between Korea and developing countries by helping build basic infrastructure. Korea's ODA strategy also involves plans to bolster the country's strengths in digital, climate change, and health sectors. In line with President Yoon's focus on Africa, he held 17 summits with African leaders, that is, before the occasion of the Korea-Africa Summit. So we are expecting to see that number expand significantly now.
Right, indeed. And Mr. Oh, what more can you tell us about the government's objectives with regard to its ODA plan, that is, for Africa?
Yeah, Korea's official development assistance for Africa can be summarized as ODA 101. That means, while many African countries enjoy high growth rate, they are vulnerable to fluctuations in mineral prices as they were in the past time, which strained their public finance. So they make little investment in education and public health when their populations are still growing. So they make little, while African countries face opposite issue to Korea in terms of population. Korea can share its past development experience and help African countries meet the basic needs of their growing populations and pursue development. Also, Korea help African countries develop critical minerals for energy transition such as nickel, lithium in Africa, and secure Korea's access to it. Sharing our development experience and partnership in economic development, they are the main objective of our ODA.
Right, and against that backdrop, so I believe you mentioned this earlier, Korea's ODA budget this year has been boosted by over 30%, I believe, compared to that of last year. Could you share the precise numbers with us, Soa?
Sure. Well, almost 2,000 ODA projects will be funded through this year's official development assistance budget, which was decided upon in late February at the government's ODA committee meeting. Now, a record high of a little under 6.3 trillion won, or $4.7 billion have been set for 2024, up from $3.1 billion last year. 2023 was the first time Korea had exceeded the 3 billion mark mark in ODA size. With that, the country ranking 14th among 31 members of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee last year. Now, for a closer look at the rate of increase, the budget for this year is a whopping 31.1% rise from last year's ODA, which was also up by 11.4% from 2022. Now, we also see some years where the budget shrank, such as in 2020 and 2022. But all in all, between 2010 and 2021, the annual average increase stood at over 8%. So we are generally seeing an expansion in Korea's ODA expenditures. Meanwhile, out of this year's budget, more than 17% is planned to be used for humanitarian crisis response in war and disaster-affected countries such as Ukraine. Around 15% is earmarked for traffic-related aid, such as constructing railroads, and 9% for healthcare assistance.
Right. Mr. Official development assistance can be extended in many forms, they say. Could you tell us a bit about the format that Korea hopes to extend to Africa?
As you know, ODA offers either grants or concessionary loans. For grant, Korea provides funding for economic, social, and educational development that can eradicate poverty. For the concessionary loans, a major portion of them in Korea is disbursed through an Economic Development Cooperation Fund, EDCF. Korea provides small-scale loans for development projects like hospital construction due to repayment issue. For your information, China allows in-kind repayment in its ODA, meaning that they get repaid with natural resources.
And this is something that Korea can think about as well,
Yeah,
then, of course. Mr. Oh, some say that Africa's agricultural aspirations also depend quite a bit on appropriate appraisals of its land.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I'm involved in geospatial information sector, and in Africa, basic infrastructure such as transport, power and water supplies, and internet connection needs to be built to reduce their reliance on agricultural sector. And in addition to those things, land cadastre and property assessment are important part of basic infrastructure. Without that, landowners cannot be well protected, for the weak, in particular women. As in many African countries, well-made systems that are properly authorized and managed by the government can reduce disputes and help with agricultural reform. For government, clear land ownership can become a valuable source of taxation. In that regard, land information systems are essential infrastructure in Africa. Korea provided the EDCF loan for Ethiopia to build the information system, land information system, and grants for Tanzania for the land cadastre education center.
Right. So Mr. Oh just mentioned neighboring China's interest in Africa and its assistance there. That being said, could you tell us a bit about China's expanding investments in the continent of Africa?
Right. China, also a country that rapidly transformed from being a donor recipient to now an emerging major donor, has been actively funding a wide variety of projects in the African continent in the past years, ranging from transportation infrastructure to agriculture, energy, minerals, health, and telecommunications. While cooperation with Africa started with the establishment of official diplomatic ties between China and Egypt in 1956, it's been more recent that Beijing increased its ODA in Africa significantly. According to data by China's finance ministry, the country's foreign aid expenditures rose steadily from 2003 to 2015, from some $631 million to $3.14 billion. Circumstances led to a decrease thereafter, but as of 2022, China's ODA reached above $3 billion again, so similar to Korea. Also, between 2013 and 2018, foreign aid to Africa accounted for 45%. Now, a signature example of China's aid to African nations was its provision of COVID-19 vaccines during the pandemic. Africa turned to China for millions of Sinopharm and Sinovac doses amid the slow vaccine rollout. Dozens of countries, including Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and South Africa, received vaccines, but also signed agreements for local manufacturing. So this case is seen by pundits as a strategy to improve the negative image of China's exploitation of African resources and labor, as well as to strengthen Sino-African ties in preparation for confrontations with the U.S. Meanwhile, one issue that also has been raised by the IMF is Africa's mounting external debt, especially with around 20% owed to China, with many African nations likely never able to pay them back. And this is also one criticism that the U.S. is raising in concerns of China's ODA to Africa.
Right. Then, Mr. keeping in mind what Soa just said, do you suppose, amid, of course, a growing global interest in Africa, do you suppose Korea itself needs to better tailor its ODA for the continent?
Yeah, Korea has its own unique strategy for Africa. We have three pillars of ODA strategy for Africa. One is Safe Africa for health and food security. Second one is Rising Africa for agriculture, industry, and urbanization. Third one is Future Africa for manpower and digital transformation. For those, based on these pillars, infrastructure construction will be accompanied by capacity building. Also, focus countries and sectoral-based countries will be designated for disseminating good outcomes of our ODA efforts. To overcome our lack of network in Africa, we will cooperate with regional international organizations such as AFDB.
Right, I see. So I hear the OECD's Development Assistance Committee recently acknowledged Korea's advances in its ODA efforts. Do tell us a bit more.
Yes, Korea received a positive assessment. I briefly mentioned the DAC, or Development Assistance Committee, before, but to give you a little bit more background, this committee is described by the OECD as a, quote, unique international forum of many of the largest providers of aid, including 32 members, unquote, with the purpose of promoting development cooperation and related policies to help implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Every year, the committee makes evaluations of 4 to 5 member countries' aid and development policies and implementation in the format of a peer review. This year was Korea's turn, making it the third such review since it became a DAC member in 2010. The report released last month described Korea as being at a pivotal juncture, taking on more responsibility on the global stage as an aid giver. The review took note of Korea's continued increase in ODA this year, mentioning the 31% raise that we talked about before. It also recognized climate-related ODA efforts and flexible and quick responses during the pandemic, because during that COVID-19 period, it was pretty difficult to spend more money for ODA for many countries. Now, there were also recommendations made, with the report suggesting improvement in strategic partnerships with multilateral actors, increasing the number of qualified staff in the field of development, and encouraging the private sector to scale up its role as an ODA delivery channel. Despite the general growth in ODA, when it comes to the ratio of ODA to South Korea's per capita gross national income, the country was still ranking in the bottom 4 as of last year. So that is calling for room for improvement.
Right, indeed. And Mr. keeping in mind the vote of confidence extended to South Korea from the OECD, in what direction do you suppose should Korea seek to navigate its ODA for Africa moving forward, of course?
So our ODA should be ODA for Africa. That means Korea's ODA prioritize the development needs of recipient countries in Africa. So that will mean building more of the basic infrastructure like roads, railways, electricity supply, along with cadastral and land information system. Also, demand for affordable housing construction will also increase, given the growing populations in the continent. Also, until recently, Korea focused on East Africa. Now, we need to expand our efforts to West African countries too. Yeah.
Right. Mr. O, speaking to the media, the AFP, the Agence France-Presse, before the Korea-Africa summit, President Yoon Suk-yeol spoke about bolstering trade ties with Africa and securing key minerals from the continent for South Korea, which depends on mineral imports for 95% of its requirements. That being said, he claimed that Korea itself would seek to share its growth strategy with Africa in return for these needs of minerals, that is. Keeping that in mind, to what extent do you suppose can South Korea share its economic growth strategy with Africa?
So becoming good partners with African countries, that's basic and important thing. And African countries have a huge growth potential if they have good benchmark cases to follow. In that regard, I would like to recommend to learn more about Korea's past economic development experience. For example, we had good economic advisor like Oh Seong-ik, who under President Park Chung-hee, and he wrote a book The Korea Story. Yeah, this is an English book, and this book is also read by Tanzanian ambassador to Seoul, Tologani Maburo.
Tell us a bit about the details of the book, briefly speaking.
So,
if you can hold it up so that the camera can have a greater close-up of the book that you're talking about.
So this book is about how Korea could develop its own economy with the view of economic advisor to President Park Chung-hee, and he summarizes what was strategy, what was implementation plan, and how it is well organized in implementing. Yeah.
Some pundits have questioned whether this strategy for South Korea can effectively work for Africa, because Africa has its own cultural and social unique aspects. So what are your thoughts on that?
In Korea's economic development, efficient government system was one good factor, and another thing was little corruption compared to other economic development cases. So that thing enhance trust among economic players. That's mine.
Mr. O, following the Korea-Africa summit, which began today and will end tomorrow with the business summit, quite a number of ministries in the government will need to come up with blueprints, plans perhaps for greater collaboration with Africa, keeping in mind your Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport. What plans do you have for Africa this year? Very briefly speaking, I understand you may not be able to share all the details.
Recently my Minister of Molit, Park Sang-hoo, visited Rwanda and discussed about how Korea can help the infrastructure development in Rwanda. And then he had good discussion, and now he will have discussion with the minister. And also tomorrow we will have big event to invite African leaders, including President of Tanzania, to show what we can cooperate as a partner. Yeah.
Right, President, right, Samia Hassan, she has spoken greatly about the prospects of greater partnership with South Korea and Tanzania. All right, Mr. Oh, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, and Soa, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you, Sunny.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Do join us again same time tomorrow.